Okay, it's almost past. Let's begin. My name is Simon Evenett, and I founded the Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. My day job is to be an economics professor, and most of you may know the work that we do collecting data on trade barriers and trade distortions through the Global Trade Alert Initiative. And this is how I got into the subject of subsidies related to climate change, which, as you know, is becoming an increasingly controversial subject, with a number of investigations being undertaken at this moment. I just want to put a few facts on the table to give you a sense of the scale of this. Since the beginning of last year, the 1st of January 2023, my team has been doing very forensic tracking of industrial policy measures, including those which are justified by governments on the grounds of advancing the climate transition. The total value of those subsidies, which were announced since the beginning of last year, was $563 billion. So this is quite a large amount of money. Of course, that money might be spent over many years, and it might be well spent. That's not the point. Is that this also could be misinterpreted by, or potentially seen differently by, trading partners. These measures have been taken by dozens of different countries, so it's not just any one country. And just to give you some, to benchmark this, over the same time frame, governments have announced industrial policy interventions to promote competitiveness of firms, and those subsidies were worth $673 billion. So you get some idea of this relative scale. And there are a number of these industrial policy interventions which have been justified publicly on both grounds, promoting competitiveness and advancing the climate transition, which of course is what raises even further eyebrows. So, with those facts on the table, what I would like us to do is to give the speakers 5 minutes each to lay out what they see as the big issues. Then we will discuss them amongst ourselves for another 20 minutes, and then open up to the floor for further comments. Our overall goal is to try and ask the question, is it at all possible to design subsidies in a way which can be aligned with the principles of the multilateral trading system? And and another way of putting this is, are there ways to design subsidy interventions which will accelerate the climate transition in ways that do not create trade tensions, or which reduce the potential for trade tensions with foreign governments? So these could be two motivating questions. But first, the first speaker is going to be Dan Esty from Yale. Dan, please.
Simon, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and special thanks to those who are going to be standing in what is clearly a hot topic. And for any of you who were in the conversation, the official conversation yesterday afternoon on sustainable development with industrial policy as kind of a sharper focus, you know that this is really at the forefront of the current debate in a number of regards. And I just want to step back for 1 minute and set the context for our conversation, which I think arises out of my prior visit 2.5 months ago to the United Arab Emirates for COP28 in Dubai. And at that COP28, there was a lot of discussion about how we address the climate change challenge. The big story of the year was not, as though, although some claimed it was, the commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. Frankly, that promise has been made in various forms since COP0, which I happen to have attended, which is the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. The big story was the global stocktake, which was a chance to reflect on the nationally determined contributions that countries have made as of the Paris Agreement of 2015, sharpened in focus by the commitment to net zero emissions by mid-century that came out of the Glasgow Climate Pact of 2021. And the question on everyone's mind when the stocktake was revealed, with emissions rising, and even where they're falling, and they're falling in a number of places, including the United States, but with only one exception, not falling fast enough to get to net zero by mid-century. And we'll leave it as a quiz question as to which one country, according to the team at Yale modeling this, is on track, but it happens to be a Scandinavian country that begins with D. Other than that, everyone in the world is not on track. So the conversation that I saw emerging at COP28 was, what next? Some of what we need to do, we know. More finance, particularly blended finance, to help the transition in the global south. More gearing up of the corporate world, getting people ready to develop new business models. But what I saw was also a recognition that the trade system may become a critical point of leverage for addressing this problem at speed and scale. And there are two big strategies in that regard. One largely advanced by Europe, carbon border adjustment, and the other by the United States, but others as well, as Simon has indicated, which is various forms of industrial policy and subsidies designed to re-gear economies around a clean energy future. And for those who are interested, I'm about to present very quickly, in the spirit of our 5-minute opening, some thoughts on what that industrial policy framework might look like. A good bit of this comes out of the project that I've been doing over the last 2 years with my Yale hat on. Some of you know I've been on public service leave from Yale at the World Trade Organization, helping the team there think about sustainability, but separately, and with my Yale hat on, working with a team of policymakers and researchers around the world on something called the Remaking Global Trade for a Sustainable Future project that's produced a comprehensive trade system reform agenda, including a focus on subsidies. And the VLR framework, as it's called, named after the Swiss mountain town where this was vetted in September, has more detail on this. And there's a set of copies of the policymaker summary for those who didn't get one on the front table there. But here's what we said about subsidies. It's not viable to have the trade system go forward as it has with a strategy of focus on subsidies that asks only one question: is it trade disruptive? And that's been the focus for the longest time. We hearken back to the Marrakesh Agreement that set the WTO up, which says, in effect, and I'm paraphrasing, the trade system is not about open markets or trade liberalization per se. Those are only means to the end of sustainable development. And there's some other commitments there, but it's a sustainable development mandate that we think needs to be taken up and put into the subsidy analysis. So if your first question is not, is it trade disruptive, but rather, what's the purpose of the subsidy? Is it sustainability enhancing or sustainability diminishing? And in effect, you can create a 2x2 matrix where one quadrant is sustainability positive, not trade disruptive, and we would say that's a green light. Another quadrant is sustainability positive, but has some trade potential disruption. We would say yellow light. And with regard to that yellow light, whether you can go forward or not depends, in our view, on 5 criteria. And I want to sketch those out because this is one of the things Simon invited us to look at in outlining this session. So number 1, is the subsidy transparent and explained in a convincing form? Does it have a rationale? This is frankly a reflection of good administrative law, which is now embedded in many countries around the world. Number 2, is it effective? Does the data actually show that the subsidy delivers on the promise of supporting a transition to a clean energy future or a sustainable future, and not simply government greenwash? Number 3, is it a disguised barrier to trade or hidden protectionism? This is a familiar test used in other contexts. Number 4, does the subsidy create market-dominant firms? And this is a worry about what is sometimes called predatory practices. I'm told that word has meaning in certain other contexts, so it may not be the right one. But again, market-dominant firms is a worry. And finally, is it proportional? Are the sustainability gains distinctly more significant than the trade losses? Finally, I would just say there's 2 other quadrants in this matrix, 2x2. One where there's no real trade effect, but it's sustainability damaging. And we would argue, although the WTO currently would say, well, no trade effect, we have nothing more to say, that's wrong. The trade system should say, no, if it's sustainability harmful, it violates our Marrakesh Agreement, paragraph 1, and we're against it. And finally, there's a quadrant that is negative from a point of view of trade disruption, negative from the point of view of sustainability. We would call that the double bad box or the double red box, and argue that people should be really pushed to bring an end to those subsidies. So that's just a starting framework, Simon. I hope that helped get the conversation going, and now Ignacio can help me sharpen my thinking here.
Well, that would be very difficult, Dan, because first of all, I really apologize because I would have loved to stay until the end, but I would probably need to revert it because of, as Simon has said, diplomatic duties, since a lot of things are happening at the other side of the vote. What I just wanted to give is just a few comments in terms of what is the direction in which our thinking in the European Union is going. And the first point which I wanted to make is that if you actually look into the challenges of achieving the climate transition, climate neutrality, governments are going to be using different types of tools. One of the tools is carbon pricing, there can be regulation, there can be subsidies. Now, theoretically, you could use a combination of those tools to achieve the same level of ambition in terms of your climate goals, but the impact that it's going to have on your domestic stakeholders is going to be very different. And the impact which is going to be had on your trading partners is going to be different depending on the policy mix. And that, I think, is the underlying reason why, as we are moving towards the climate neutrality objectives, inevitably there are going to be potential trade tensions. There is the risk of subsidy races, and there's something that obviously one needs to be concerned about. There's also tensions related to the application of trade-related climate measures. And that's why we think that it is really important at this point in time to see how the WTO can be responsive to what is a reality which is going to become, if anything, more of a reality as we're getting closer towards trying to achieve our climate goals. So what it is that the WTO can do? Now, first, I think one really needs to look into this issue a little bit holistically. And although the focus here seems to be exclusively about climate change-related subsidies, I think one really needs to look at this a little bit from a broader perspective. There is obviously issues relating to agricultural subsidies. And I would argue that, for instance, reduction of trade distorting domestic support is a good example of a win-win policy, something that would be good from the point of view of reducing negative trade impacts, but that would also be good from the point of view of protection of the environment. So that shows why, for instance, in that area, the WTO could make a contribution that combines both trade and an environmental objective. Obviously, we are talking about climate change, but climate change is just one of the global environmental problems that we are facing, and that's why the discussion that we are having at this point in time to try to see why we can conclude a fisheries subsidies agreement is extremely important. It is the first time that an agreement has been designed in the WTO with a double objective. On the one hand, it is to ensure that there is a level playing field, but also to ensure that you are protecting the global commons, that you are taking action to ensure the sustainability of fish stocks. Again, it's introducing into the WTO matrix concerns that go beyond purely trade, that also include the sustainability concerns. And of course, a very important part of the conversation is also about what happens to support to industry. And that's why we think that the conversations about industrial subsidies and other forms of support that countries are undertaking for climate or for other goals is a very important conversation that needs to be developed in the WTO. And as I said, it's not only about climate change, it is a broader type of conversation because there are different reasons why countries may be subsidizing, why countries may be intervening in the market to achieve certain policy objectives. Now, our immediate objective in this connection in the WTO is to open up that conversation, not with the point of view of ready to start to negotiate rules. I think you need to get a little bit the culture in the WTO that before you decide whether you want to negotiate a rule or not, you really need to have a good discussion. You need to understand the dimensions of the issue. You need to have as much of a fact-based conversation as possible. And that's the phase where we think we are currently moving forward in the WTO. We hope, if you don't know, what would be agreed in the context of this week. And of course, one of the elements of that conversation would also be whether or not there is a need to modernize the rules of the WTO on industrial subsidies. Now, if you are looking into the question of the modernization of the rules on the WTO, then you are going to have to look into many issues. I mean, I would say, I would agree with you, Dan, a fundamental basis for any potential modernization of the rules is transparency. Unless you really have all the information that is necessary to be able to evaluate the impact of subsidies, and there's not really going to be possible to imagine that we can have any effective disciplines in the WTO. So transparency is certainly going to be a fundamental basis for anything else that might need to be developed. You would need to be also looking into those subsidies which have a more negative impact on trade. Should you be looking also at the same time into subsidies from the point of view of their negative impact on the environment? I think that's an interesting idea which is raised by the BDS framework. It raises, of course, a lot of very complicated issues, and I think that Simon, in his paper, has indicated some of the difficult challenges about actually trying to develop such a matrix. I mean, theoretically, you could argue that there are some cases that could look relatively simple. If you are, for instance, subsidizing the carbon-intensive industrial sector, unless you are actually limiting the subsidy to what is necessary to achieve a climate objective, you are creating a negative impact on trade, and you are also creating a negative impact on the climate transition. So there you could say there's a double negative which is actually being applied. On the other hand, there may well be cases in that you adopt a subsidy that might have effectiveness from the point of view of fulfilling your environmental objectives, but it has very significant negative spillover effects on your trading partners. And how do you evaluate those types of subsidies? So trying to get the balance right between these elements of the metrics, I think is going to be extremely complicated, but I think that is an interesting challenge, and I think that from that point of view, I find it very, very worthwhile that this debate is being open. Although let me say, before you actually get into any exercise about negotiation rules, there's a lot of groundwork that will have to be done in order to have a better understanding about the different types of subsidies which are being granted, their impacts, and the way in which this could actually lead, potentially, to an effort to modernize the rules of the WTO on subsidies. And of course, it is true that in the past, in the Uruguay round, there was a green box that was actually included in the initial subsidies agreement, which expired after 5 years. So it's not the first time that you have introduced the concept of a green box into the WTO. I would say it's a little bit early, at least from our point of view, to come to a conclusion about whether a new green box is needed or not, because as I said, this really has to be looked at from a broader perspective about how to try to ensure that you have disciplines on subsidies which are effective, which are based on transparency, and then you might want to look whether or not, as part of that exercise, you may want to consider the possibility of a well-designed green box, because it cannot be greenwashing. When you are going to be considering that a certain type of subsidy should be given some particular recognition, you need to show that the subsidy is effective towards achieving environmental goals, but it also has no or minimal impact on trade. I mean, otherwise it would be very difficult to tell any country that they cannot actually react to the impact that the subsidy is having on their trade, simply because the objective of the subsidy was pursuing a certain environmental objective. So I will leave it like that, and I will try to stay a little bit to hear what colleagues have to say, but I may not be able to stay for the whole discussion.
Thank you, Ignacio. Tatiana, please.
Thank you. So how long?
5 minutes, 5, 6 minutes.
5? Okay. So, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tatiana Prazeres. I'm the Foreign Trade Secretary of Brazil. I have two broader issues to cover. The first, as well, as you may know, Brazil is leading G20 this year. And one of our priorities in the Trade and Investment Working Group is trade and sustainable development. So we are conducting an exercise that somehow addresses the question, which is how we can ensure that trade and sustainable development can be mutually reinforcing. And we are, proposing G20 members to think about principles that could somehow lead to more compatibility, to mutually reinforcing approach in these two big policy areas. So this is a big challenge for us this year. But I'd rather get into the wider debate before. Happy to take questions on how we see G20 work moving forward. My first point here, it's kind of, and by the way, I have many questions, and it's a tough topic, and it's at the heart of the debate, the policy debate in today's world. So I don't pretend to have the answers for that, not as an individual, and Brazil, my country also, we have an internal debate going on this topic. Our foreign minister spoke yesterday on this panel that Dan referred to. We have some views on the topic, but that is not to say that we have the answers to this conundrum, frankly, that we face as Brazil on the matter. My first point here, I would say, relates to a conceptual concern. So we're talking here about climate change-related subsidies. And we are in a trade and sustainability hub, and sustainability and sustainable development for Brazil encompasses 3 dimensions, right? So it's about economic, social, and environmental sustainability. We're talking here, and we feel there's a lot of focus on the environmental dimension of sustainable development, and within the environmental dimension, a lot of focus on climate. And to be very clear here, this is not to underestimate the climate emergency that we all going through. And the Brazilian government is deeply committed to fighting climate change, to fighting deforestation in the country, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to that. But from a conceptual point of view, I think we need to think, about sustainability in its broader sense, and that's not Brazil saying that. There's a UN well-established concept on sustainable development. For many developing countries, in addition to the climate emergency, we have social and economic emergencies, for example, related to poverty, to starvation, etc. So if we're thinking about new rules carving out climate subsidies alone could be challenging, right? But at the same time, carving out all the subsidies related to the other dimensions of sustainable development would mean that you could be hollowing out the entire rules-based system, which is not something that we would like to see. So again, I'm referring to these challenges that we face in addressing the problem. We don't want to. It's not that we don't want. I mean, we need to think in broader terms and the impact of a design in climate special rules and where all the rest fits in this broader discussion. And mind you, as Simon, recent research shows, and you mentioned that just now, many countries have been adopting measures that whose stated objectives are climate and competitiveness, climate and industrial policy. So how can we think about rules that would somehow properly address the issue? Then, just to comment briefly, and we can further discuss that, some challenges, some dilemmas that we face as a developing country, as a large developing country. First of all, distortions, implications for competition in global markets, but in our own market. So how do we deal with the fact that other countries have bigger pockets, have more conditions to provide subsidies than you do, and at the same time, if you want to, develop not only a transition towards a low carbon economy, but also transition to an industrialized country, a country that is high tech, that is able to produce high value added products, etc., etc. You don't want to endorse, you don't want to give acquiescence to policies that somehow would not only violate current rules, but be detriment to your own economic interests. And again, economic and social dimensions are part of the whole development debate. So while we recognize the importance of the positive effects that certain subsidies may have, not only in trade but also for the environment. Trade is tricky, but let's stick with the environment for now. We have concerns about the negative impacts with trade, distortions it may cause, and the impact on your own ability as a country to develop the type of industries that you want to see for the future. Third comment relates to a potential subsidy war. Of course, a tit for tat in subsidies would not be a good thing, but not all countries would engage in that because they don't have the resources. But for a country like Brazil, who does not have the means that other countries have, but have trade remedies, a well-established trade remedies mechanism, the risk is that you see increasing numbers of requests for trade remedies. And by the way, we're seeing that in Brazil today. So the risk is that the response may not only come in terms of more subsidies, but in terms of trade remedies. And that can spiral down really quickly. As a trade official in my country, I see all the time private sector coming to me saying, look at, what country X is doing, look at what country Y. Why are we kind of sitting in your hands, frankly? And it's very challenging to deal with that. So even if you don't have the resources to respond to a subsidy war with subsidies, there will be pressure on governments to respond with trade remedies. If you don't have the tools, to compete in the subsidy war, you may have tools to, engage in another kind of not so interesting dispute. Fourth point, and I just have one extra. What does this conversation mean for the discussion on agricultural subsidies? So Brazil has been fighting for more than 30 years for subsidies, domestic subsidies, to be properly regulated in the WTO. If we're considering, carving out industrial subsidies or climate subsidies in the context of this, the challenge that we face today, does it mean that we will give up on the discussions of constraining policy space for agricultural subsidies? How can we ensure that the debt that WTO, the trading system has with agricultural exporters is not lost in the conversation, where, well, we may need policy space for everything. So instead of limiting distortions created by agricultural subsidies, we are just creating more distortion, and then you established a new balance by allowing everyone to subsidize. Then my final comment is, well, we need to face this discussion. I clearly don't have the answers, as you can see. I have a lot of questions, but the elephant has been in the room for a while now. We need to have a serious conversation about how to deal with those issues. I agree, we need to start with transparency. We need to have a clear sense. There's groundwork, I think, to be done. There are some proposals. Our Foreign Minister yesterday referred to the African group proposal as a potential good starting point for a conversation. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. My questions are not to suggest that we're against or pro or whatever. It's just that it's a very complex issue, but Brazil is ready to engage in a constructive conversation about how to address, the issues of policy space, industrial development, and climate subsidies. We cannot pretend that this issue can be disentangled. They are all connected, which makes things more complicated, but here we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. As I said earlier, Mrs. Lee from the Chinese mission was supposed to come. Unfortunately, she couldn't. She was called away from her diplomatic duties. So we're very lucky that we have a Chinese voice, an expert voice who can speak. And so I asked Professor Tu to share a few words with us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Simon, for having me here. I would like to use the term of a green industrial subsidy to describe subsidies related to climate change. It will be simpler. I would like to share a few points of mine on this topic. Firstly, industrial policy has always been a controversial issue in economics. In my opinion, the purpose of traditional industrial policy for the followers is mainly import substitution, which could help establish their own industries, while for the leaders is to develop new upstream industries with leading or monopolistic powers. But the case of green industrial policy is very different because the green industries are created by social or political demand rather than economic demand. The green industries won't appear at all if only economic benefits are considered. They are originally against economic logic. Therefore, governments have to pay for the emergence and development of the green industries for the sake of the whole society and humankind. In this sense, the rationality of green industrial policy does not depend on its economic reasoning, and therefore we cannot judge it only through economic perspective, as Professor Esty said. Since every country and government is responsible for fighting environmental degradation and climate change, all of them should encourage the development of green industries and technologies. Of course, there will be some international competition in the making and implementation of such kind of green industrial policies, but it should be generally encouraged because fierce competition could stimulate the efficiency, enhancement, and technological progress. While those supportive or positive green industrial policies, especially subsidies, are indispensable for the development of green industries, protective or negative industrial policies, such as high or punitive tariffs, are not desirable. simply because they will hamper the development of global green industries as a whole. And secondly, in legal terms, industrial policy, especially subsidies, are not totally prohibited by WTO rules. Only those subsidies with the aim to promote exports or replace imports are definitely illegal. Actually, in the original text, there was a kind of non-actionable subsidies, including those for the purpose of enhancing environmental standards. There is also a general exception for the protection of human, animal, and plant health. Since the development of green industries is vital for the fight against environmental degradation and climate change, governments should be given enough policy space to make and implement supportive industrial policies. Countries should impose due restraint on the use of countermeasures against those supportive industrial policies. Thirdly, China is the largest country and manufacturer in the world, and thus has the largest urgency to transform our energy structure and fight against environmental pollution. China has set a very high standard of carbon peak and carbon neutrality for itself. So we have to take proactive policies to reach those goals. Unlike being a follower in other established industries, China was only a little late in entering the green industries and has been faster in terms of catching up with the leaders, and is even taking the lead in some areas, like the solar panel industry and the electric vehicle industry. And with the help of large subsidies, mainly encouraging the consumption rather than production of green products, such as EVs, China has become the most efficient contributor or maker of the economically available and affordable green products. Consumers won't buy those too expensive green products just for the reason of environmental protection. We must create enough economic incentives for them. So for green industries which are still technologically and economically underdeveloped, industry policy is necessary and has positive contribution to the broad interests of the world. Members should work together to legitimize certain types of green industrial subsidies and avoid the use of protective policies disrupting the global market of green products. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've gone a little bit over time compared to the 20 minutes we were supposed to spend. So I suggest, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to just ask a few questions, and then we can collect some questions from people who have joined us today, and then turn it back to the panel and wrap up on time. That's the plan. Okay. So when I listen to Dan speak and also Ignacio about subsidies, the first question that always comes up is going to be what's the boundary between a subsidy and a non-subsidy? We've had these debates with respect to China. One can talk about state transfers from state bodies, but then what happens when we get into state-owned enterprises? What happens when we have a dual pricing from state utilities towards some industries which have different prices than others? Where is the boundary of this discussion is my first question, because I think we'll run into that. The second question is, Dan put on the table a test of, is the policy effective? Well, in work that we're doing for the European Climate Foundation, trying to scope out what it would mean to track effectively climate-related subsidies, we were interested in this question too. And we've been looking at policy statements to see if there's many statements of the expected outcomes. And it's remarkable how few governments even bother to state what they expect to see happen here. So how can we know whether something is effective? So that worries me too. A third thing that worries me, and then also heartens me, is that I fear that because the business environments in many countries are not particularly competitive and are over-regulated, that in order to get the green transition going, many governments are putting much more money on the table in terms of subsidies than they would have to, if they were to clean up their regulations. So do we need a sort of last resort test, which is, yes, you can subsidise, but only after the government has cleaned up its domestic regulatory mess beforehand? Okay? I just put that on the table to be more than a little bit provocative. so that was that. Now, if Ignacio had, oh, by the way, I should add here, the good news story here is if you look at the EU's Critical Raw Materials Initiative, they actually put getting licensing and that side right as part of the solution. So I think there is a comprehensive package here, but we shouldn't demote the traditional supply side reform. Now, if Ignacio were here, I would ask him a question which I know he could answer because he was there when we were there. 20 years ago, there was something called the Singapore Issues, which had a process at the WTO which was supposed to be educative, which was supposed to encourage deliberation and transparency. That process was subverted and it became a shadow negotiation. How do we make sure that any discussion about subsidies doesn't descend into a shadow negotiation right from the start? And I think that would worry me. I just wanted to say to Tatiana, I really agree with you about concerns about countries that don't have subsidies being able to fight subsidies. In our work that we have done on the New Industrial Policy Observatory, we find that if either the EU, the US, or China introduces a subsidy, within 6 months, there's a 72% chance that in the same HS code, one of the others introduces either a subsidy or an import restriction. So this dynamic should not be underestimated. This is very much there, and we have to address it. As for my question to Professor Tu is the following. As you know, at the moment, Chinese EVs are being investigated by the European Commission for subsidies. And one of the leading companies is BYD, which is doing very, very well in the EU market. This is a company which has gone public in its criticism of the subsidy investigation. This company made $2.5 billion in economic profit last year. I cannot imagine a subsidy penalties on this company which are going to stop it from exporting to the EU or which are going to change its pricing behavior. So my question to you is the expected amount of relief to German and other European EV producers from this investigation zero? Because whatever the fines are or whatever the penalty is, the tariff is, the CVD tariff is just going to be absorbed as a cost of doing business. In which case, why are our friends in Europe doing this? Anyway, just a few thoughts. Just a few thoughts to keep us all going. Would anyone else like to ask our colleagues on the panel a question? Please, madam.
Hello.
And please say who you are.
Sure, I will.
Thank you.
My name is Tatiana, and I am the economic diplomacy researcher at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy here in the UAE. And as part of the UAE delegation, I had the privilege of attending yesterday's discussion ministerial on the trade and sustainability. So I wanted to ask those of you who were there, what do you make of the statements of some countries in Latin America, I'm not going to say names, not you, who seem to be saying that they don't even want to have a discussion that's institutionalized on trade and climate or sustainability whatsoever, that this is not the right moment, that the topic is not mature enough, that it's not up for discussion whatsoever, and they don't want to be part of that.
Okay, let's take a couple more and then we go back to the panel. Please.
Mallory Charles from the Center for European Policy Studies, which is a Brussels-based think tank. I have a question regarding the modernization of the subsidy rules at the WTO. So it's a difficult, even very difficult issue to tackle, given that it also relates to the issue of competitive neutrality with respect to the industrial subsidies. So what would be actually the best approach to adopt with respect to this reform of the subsidy rules, and what would be a reasonable time frame? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, one last.
So Mayra, IFF, International Favors Finance, I'm from the private sector, and I'll pick up on your point about the regulatory mess. And I'll go a little bit beyond, and I'm not going to give the right name or the exact country, but on that point, this happens that you have a subsidy to promote innovation, but you need to commercialize somewhere else because in that country it's not even regulated yet to go to the market. And then we see this with different policies, not only about subsidies, but different policies that they're just incoherent, not harmonized at all. So as a company that you're investing and researching and developing is really difficult. And I just want to mention that, but I think you know what I mean.
Christopher, you have a question.
Yeah, and very quickly, generally I think it's great to have this discussion, and it's very important to also promote it in the WTO. What is not clear to me is how we should frame that discussion. Is it about subsidies, or is it about more broadly green industrial policies? And I think for a lot of countries, a limited discussion on subsidies might not be that attractive compared to a broader discussion, subsidies under a broader discussion. Is it about climate, or is it about environment? And we know that there are lots of trade-offs also between different environmental objectives and is it just about environment, or is it about sustainable development, keeping in mind also those different types of trade-offs? And finally, a key question to me, if we want this discussion to progress, is what is really the problem that we're trying to solve? In other words, what is the kind of market failure that we're trying to address? When we think about maybe enhanced flexibility, I think it would be very important to articulate, what is the market failure that we're trying to address, and when would it make sense to act on this?
I think I'd like to get some answers from the panel first, and then we will try about.
So I think a number of the questions circle around what Christoph just asked, which is what is the market failure? And I would say that it is the failure to rise to the challenge of addressing sustainability broadly, but climate change in particular, and dramatic underinvestment in what's required to transition to a sustainable future. And I think Professor Tu gave us that answer, but I'll just reinforce that as the fundamental logic. And I think that, just to answer a couple of the other issues on the table, I think that what we also heard from Ignacio was a recognition of that important need for policy frameworks that are going to get us toward a sustainable future. And it happens Europe has a very strong preference for the price signal approach as opposed to the subsidy approach. And I would say, with love in my heart for the European Union, that it is absolutely 100% conceptually correct that nobody should get competitive advantage in the 21st century going forward from underperforming on committed environmental standards. Having said that, and by the way, as a policymaker and someone who's worked on climate change for 30 years, I would say that it is also the case that from a policy perspective, we have systematically failed to get where we need to go without some structure. Now the question is, in a diverse world of diverse politics, can you get everybody on board the first best policy choice of a price signal? And I'm doubtful. And in that regard, I would say to the European Union, you need to go beyond a narrow focus on explicit carbon pricing. You need to reflect a broader set of climate change strategies, and beyond that, sustainability strategies. And that there will certainly be countries that are doing subsidy more than pricing. But I do think that one wants to discipline both the use of a carbon border adjustment, or, as was hinted at, a broader sustainability border adjustment over time, with a structure that minimizes the disruption to trade. And likewise, we should have the same parallel framework around structure of discipline around the use of subsidies. And I do want to just answer the question on Latin America, because it's actually quite curious. There's an initial work being done on what the world looks like if sustainability becomes more deeply embedded in the framework of trade. And two regions of the world are systematically advantaged. One is Africa and the other is Latin America. So if I were in a Latin American policymaking position and maybe they need a little bit more homework done, I would be saying, bring it on. Let's have a world where sustainability is essential to the framework. And I think the Latin American countries, particularly in agriculture, are going to be advantaged. So last thought, the framework that I sketched out, this 2x2 matrix with sustainability as a second element of analysis, is going to shift comparative advantage and actually shifted strongly in the direction of the Latin American agricultural producers. So there's, having overlaid that, I would say no region of the world is more likely to benefit. And the logic of this, the political logic globally, is the opportunity to dramatically reduce production-based agriculture subsidies. By the way, they don't have to go away. They should be repurposed as support for farmers to do sustainable development. But if that were to happen, our preliminary analysis, very rough, looking really at other people's work, suggests 60 or 70 developing countries dramatically advantaged by the commitment to take down agricultural production-based subsidies, even if they're repurposed. But the taking down of those subsidies create a lot of market opportunity.
Thank you. Tatiana.
Oh, there's a lot to digest here. First of all, I was not in the panel yesterday. I was just read my minister's remarks. But my comment here goes also in the direction of what you're saying about the Singapore issues, right? So WTO, you may start with a discussion, etc., and then all of a sudden you see yourself in a situation where you don't want to be in. So again, I'm not trying to second guess the countries from the region, but I wouldn't be surprised if some were concerned that you start with a kind of a discussion and just discussion and then all of a sudden you see yourself in a conversation where, well, this will lead to a situation where some of other countries' policies will be carved out from the rules, and the type of subsidies they can provide and policy objectives that they prefer will be accepted, from disciplines, and you see yourself in a situation where you don't have the resources to provide such subsidies, and you see your market affected by subsidies provided by others, and then all that well covered by the rules. So when you look at the history of the multilateral trading system, you acknowledge the imbalances, the unfulfilled promises of the system. You want to be very careful in the type of conversation you endorse. You agree to engage in. Again, I'm not suggesting that. I'm not saying that this is the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if some countries were reluctant to start a conversation that could ultimately lead to, well, we'll be endorsing policies that we cannot pursue and will be affecting us negatively. Just an idea here. Just a comment here. Sorry, on the what is the market failure we are trying to address, and I think your guess, I think you framed in a quite convincing way. But when you think about sustainability, what do you think that will be the reaction of some if you say, well, instead of climate change related subsidies, poverty reduction related subsidies, would that be a legitimate goal to pursue? A kind of conversation, members. I don't know. So it's just it's pretty challenging, to define that question. But I think that would be a good starting point for a conversation where members would be comfortable to engage in. If we don't have a clear sense of what we're talking about, the skepticism, I think, would raise very quickly. And finally, again, to that question, it's very difficult to disentangle, what is competitiveness and what is climate. And CBAM, I think, it's a primary example of how those two issues get entangled in a way that it's challenging to address from a normative perspective.
Tatiana, just 10 seconds response. I think Simon said and Ignacio both said that the details matter of these subsidy frameworks. And I think you highlighted one of the most significant ones, which is consumption-based subsidies, supporting your impoverished public, fits within a sustainable development umbrella quite comfortably. And I think is treated very differently than production-based subsidies.
Okay. Actually, it is kind of surprising that you launched this investigation on Chinese EV exports. Actually, China started to export EVs just a few years ago, like in 2020. So it was still a very short period, and especially Chinese exporting prices are higher than the domestic prices. Like as you mentioned, the BYD, BYD's exporting prices are almost 100% higher than domestic prices. So it's not dumping. It's very different from the older experience, older practices. So right now, actually, the penetration rate of EVs in Chinese market is very high, over 30%. So now Chinese consumers can afford those cheap and good EVs. So I think the problem, as you said, for the European companies is to increase their competitiveness. But another thing I should mention is that the exports of Chinese EVs actually almost half of them are from foreign invested companies in China, like Tesla, Volkswagen, and Mercedes. I think at least the Chinese market is open, and also as Professor Esty mentioned, our subsidies in this industry at least are basically consumption based. So all car makers are benefiting from these subsidies, including foreign companies investing in China. So yeah. Anyway, another thing you mentioned is the boundary of subsidies and especially the role of SOEs. I know there is a big concern about the Chinese SOEs. Of course, we have a large number of SOEs, but actually, most Chinese SOEs are not so much involved in international competition, like in the EV industry. Only very few Chinese SOEs are competitive. So like a BYD and also Tesla, I mean, the most competitive companies are private ones and foreign companies. And in this industry, at least, actually, SOEs are mainly focused on infrastructure development, especially the charging stations. Many charging stations are invested by SOEs. Even state-owned oil companies are investing in establishing charging stations to replace their own oil products. So, but I think this is good to reduce the cost of using electrical vehicles. So,
thanks. We have 3 people who want to speak before we end. So this gentleman's been very patient, this gentleman and this lady. Please.
Professor, as a fellow American, I have a 3-part question, so I'll be quick. First of all, do you think the Inflation Reduction Act did meet the framework that you laid out? Number 2, does GATT 20 give you a framework that you could use sufficiently? And I guess the other question I have is, do you think there should be a different set of rules as between subsidies writ large versus the countervailing duty rules?
Versus what?
Countervailing duty.
Sir, you have.
Just one question is actually about subsidizing or not subsidizing. Policymakers always facing an issue from government perspective and companies. Everyone would like to hijack the show. Did anyone was able to find a solution for this competition?
I guess it's as much a comment, but it seems to me what strikes me is that we need to start by, we don't ask the question as to what would that look like from a development perspective. So it seems, and there's no criticism, but it seems like, we don't come, it's the G77 in China and developing countries are coming at this as a reactive, right? Reacting to the CBAM, reacting to the RA. But if we were to say, what are the synergies and trade-off between climate and SDGs? Establish that from empirically for developing countries and sit at the table with the partners and say, okay, what are the solutions? I think we would get further than trying to discuss it at the higher level. And I think I'm not hearing enough and there's enough to hear what others think.
Okay, we have 2 minutes each for each speaker, and then 1 minute for me. So, Dan, 2 minutes, please.
All right, which will inevitably require cutting short some of the discussion. But anyone who wants to continue this, the Remaking Trade Project is going to be presenting its views, including on subsidies, tomorrow here, 2 o'clock in room A. So anyone who hasn't had enough, come back for more. And there are copies of this framework that will be sort of the starting point for that conversation tomorrow. I think the question of whether the U.S. IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the industrial subsidy project of the Biden administration, would meet the framework I've laid out, the answer is no at the current moment. But I think one of the most important points that came out today, Simon raised it, Ignacio reinforced it, is we really want to make people defend their projects and have a rationale. And I think if the U.S. had the prospect of getting the IRA through that yellow box to green by taking off the rough edges, the domestic content requirements and a few other things, it would be enormously positive. And forcing them to talk about it, Simon, I don't know whether this is really your bottom line, but it's actually a good thing to make people defend what they're doing. Chantaline, I think the same to you. There is a development perspective that needs to be taken seriously, and by making people talk about it, it's embarrassing if you don't have an answer to it. I think actually the European Union is somewhat embarrassed that they don't have a good answer to the developing impacts of CBAM, and I hope that they start to clean that up. But I think the idea of transparency, of required rationale presentation, is itself a well-established best practice in administrative law, domestically in many countries. It should apply here.
Thank you. Tatiana, anything to add?
No.
Okay.
So I think, as Professor Esty mentioned, I think those green industries are underinvested and underdeveloped. So we need more investments from companies and subsidies from government. I wouldn't call it as a subsidy war. I think we call it a subsidy competition. Companies could compete with each other with most efficient production, and governments could also compete with each other with most efficient subsidies. And those subsidies could be, as I said, indispensable for the benefits of the whole world, especially in the green transformation. So, yeah.
Gosh, very few are in this league, huh?
So thank you everyone for contributing to this this discussion. There's a lot for us to digest on. First, what problem are we trying to solve? What is the origin of this market failure? If there is underinvestment, why is there underinvestment? And then, if there is underinvestment, what is the right subsidy instrument? And since we're all experimenting so actively with subsidies, how can we learn which ones work better than others so that we can inform the next round of subsidy development? So this is a sort of iterative process that ought to take place somewhere. Whether it's just that it should take place at the WTO, I guess, is for people to decide above my pay scale. But thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions.